as I said, I don't think he would have played a primary role in facilitating our work and our entry or our acquisition of liaison and so forth in Feldafing, because we were right there. Mm-hmm. The first few months of our stay in Bavaria, our office was in Feldafing, and we had a house that the Army requisitioned for us not far away.
Well, you were without major supplies at that point.
That's right.
Was he helpful in bringing supplies? Do you remember?
I don't think in Feldafing. My recollection is that he got supplies for Jews that did not have the same access to UNRWA that the Jews in Feldafing had.
No, was UNRWA providing the necessary...
UNRWA, yes. UNRWA and the Army were providing the food and the clothing and so forth in Feldafing. And in Landsberg, which was the other major camp, it opened, I think, shortly after Feldafing. At first it was only partially Jewish, and I think he and we together pushed for making it a Jewish camp, because we needed, at that time, all Jewish camps. The Jewish DPs could not live in the same camps with the Polish and Lithuanian DPs and Latvian DPs who had decided to come voluntarily into Germany with the Germans, and who had a notorious history of anti-Semitism. I've forgotten the details of how Landsberg became all Jewish. I think there was a Jewish UNRWA director in Landsberg who helped on that. But I'm sure Abe went around everywhere pounding tables on that. But without question, he was the one who got the supplies for St. Ottilien, which, while it was a place like St. Ottilien, and there were a number of other sort of small places where Jews had gotten and where he had brought them things. Now, come to think of it, though it was before I arrived, it seems to me he may have told me that in the early days of Feldafing, when it was first established, in those immediate post-war days, before even UNRWA was organized adequately, he had brought loads of things to the camps. Mm-hmm. Now that was not after our time, because when we arrived, UNRWA was already operating. I wouldn't be surprised if he had, through the camp committees, who had some independence, and with whom he had very close relationships in both Feldafing and Landsberg, I wouldn't be surprised if he brought things and bypassed perhaps the UNRWA channels, even after we arrived.
But you didn't work in concert?
No, I did not work in close contact with him.
Was this by choice?
Well, first of all, he was all over the place. You couldn't see him whenever you wanted him. He'd hear that some Jews were in need somewhere. They had a problem. There were still a lot of people around who were less than sympathetic to these Jewish survivors. And I would guess that Abe would come in on a scene of that sort and would scare the daylights out of anybody, particularly if they were civilians, German or other.
Which was against the law.
For him to do this.
Yes.
Sure. He was a chaplain who was, I don't know, I remember his telling me how he managed to operate so freely in spite of the fact that he was attached to some army unit somewhere as a chaplain, but either he had some sympathetic superiors, or else things were so disorganized he could capitalize on this and do anything he wanted to do. And he was all over the place doing sort of rescue operations, troubleshooting. Troubleshooting is a good word, I think, for Abe's role. After I arrived, and not because of my arrival, but because at the time I arrived, UNRWA was already on the scene, and I would think the bureaucracy and the red tape and whatnot by that time had gotten stronger, and it wouldn't be as easy for him to do the kind of significant things, like maybe he did start St. Ottilien, maybe he just went in there and requisitioned it.
That's what he said.
Well, that's sort of, I think...
that's in character.
Yeah, that's completely in character, and he could so buffalo the Germans and the lower brass, the lower echelon army people, and sometimes not so low, by just sort of articulating the injustice of this thing and putting people on their defensive. What do you mean not taking care of?
You saw him in action?
Well, it's such a long time. I'm sure I must have seen him in action a few times.
This is your general impression?
Yeah, this is my impression of him. Now, I had a certain amount of mine was not an easy position, representing the JDC, which at that time was so vulnerable.
Especially in that area.
And where he was already top dog, and he is not an easy person to begin with, but I was not about to get involved in personalities. There were much bigger issues than that, and I think we must have worked together in specific things. I can't remember precisely. I should say we were only in Feldafing for about 3 months. As I say, he had introduced me, if I'm not mistaken, he had introduced me to some of the Army military government people in Munich that I had to deal with. I would have met them anyway. After the 3 months, we had requisitioned a building on, it was Kaunstrasse, K-A-U-N, or Siebertstrasse, in Munich.
Number 3, Siebertstrasse.
Right. I think I requisitioned that building through the Army. I don't know whether Abe played a role in that or not. Did he claim that he did?
I think that he said that he was involved in that, yes, but...
I think we might have worked jointly on that. I know I had some significant role in it, simply because I could work through official channels as the official JDC, or I could work through channels better than he could.
But wasn't that established?
I think he might have...
Before you came, or no?
You mean he'd already established it before we came? My impression was that we got that building. It was a large 3-story, it was originally a dwelling house, I think, but it was large. The Central Committee was located.
Right.
The JDC office was located.
Right.
The JDC Bavarian headquarters moved from Feldafing to that building.
Okay.
Maybe Abe already had some operation in some part of that building. My impression was that we did something in getting that building.
Okay.
And I don't think, that he just got it all for us.
Right.
Maybe we worked together on it.
I mean, you can't imagine trying to find a place for JDC.
No, I don't think that would... Well, he was quite bitter, but I think he would have recognized that eventually we'd be functioning, we'd be operating. And maybe when the peak of the need was over from his point of view, although in point of fact, the peak of the need didn't come until later when we had the 100,000 or so people coming out of Poland and Bavaria. At that time, the JDC was operating. Well, Siebertstrasse became the headquarters for Levi Becker after me, and Leo Schwartz after Levi, I think, and I don't know whether Sam Haber also stayed there. But we saw each other, of course, a great deal after we moved to Siebertstrasse. He was in Munich a lot, and there were camp visits and meetings with the Central Committee. The Central Committee was originally his baby. I think he must have played a major role in organizing the Central Committee.
In organizing and directing it.
Yeah, that's right. They looked to him for guidance. And more than to us, no question about it. He was their boy. He had been with them from the beginning. And Dr. Greenberg, who was the head of Centro Tilian, was the head of the Central Committee. Probably Abe put him in office. Abe, he was everything. He was a politician, a behind-the-scenes guy. He just did everything. It was a spectacular period. And I never saw the most spectacular part of it, which was in the war ended in March, didn't it? May. That's right. Sure, I was demobilized in May 12th, so I went to work for the JDC by latter May. I was in Paris for about 6 weeks. They sent me back in the early part of July, and
you missed
I missed the peak period for him to operate, when there was total chaos, but also the need was so dramatic for the people. Now, other chaplains were there too, but none had the daring that he did to just take off completely. They at least stayed with their units.
Were you involved with any other chaplains during that particular period of time? Did you see anybody else working?
Well, in Bavaria, I met Max Braudy at some point.
What's your impression of that, of what he was doing?
Can you tell me what he was doing, officially or unofficially?
Yes, well, he was in the constabulary of the 7th Army.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the one who was able to, according to him, be able to know when patrols are going out, what was going to happen. He covered for Klausner, he says.
Wasn't he Klausner's superior nominally?
Yes, yes. In fact, the story that he tells about how Klausner got to Dachau was that he traded a pistol to some army officer to get Klausner assigned to Dachau.
Does Klausner agree with this, or?
Well, Klausner, I spoke to Browdy after that.
I see.
So Klausner does not know to this day how he got to Dachau.
Well, Klausner was critical of everybody, chaplains included. You know, he was critical of everybody for not doing more, for not doing enough. And I think I almost remember him just saying disparaging things about everybody. There was a bitterness.
Mm-hmm. He felt that the burden was entirely...
Well, he didn't mind the burden. I mean, he was made to order for this role, and he loved the spotlight. He had a tremendous ego. But there was a denigrating of almost everybody else, as I recall.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, whether they did or they didn't.
Well, the fact is, very little was done except by Klausner in those early days in Bavaria. No, well,
is that
let me qualify that. I don't know what happened before I came in Bavaria. After I was there, at least in the Munich area, no chaplain could operate the way Abe did.
Right. I think there's
everybody else had some superiors and some chaplain's duties to perform. He had somehow gotten some kind of an assignment whereby he was free, and maybe Browdy played a role in that.
He made his own.
All right. Well, but he bluffed it through. Nobody worried about it.
He simply left his unit.
Yeah, that's right. That's what he told me, I think. But he capitalized on the chaos.
Right.
Nobody, it's hard to keep track of people. I remember when the army wanted to know where he was, they used to go through Browdy and say, Browdy, when you see Klausner, I want you to do this because we have a bunch of Jews. And another time they didn't know where, that he existed. Yeah. There were a tremendous number of troubleshooting assignments before and after we arrived. Jews were still coming in or coming from all directions, and they'd end up places, and they needed looking after. We got such a call once about a group of Jews in eastern Bavaria near the Czechoslovakian border who had been, some of them had been prisoners of war with the Yugoslavian army, and some had just been some people who had ended up there in a camp, and I can't remember the name of it. That was a camp that we succeeded. I think that was one that we did the troubleshooting job on. I sent Dr. Hightown out to look at it, and he came back and reported there were several hundred people there, and they were in desperate need, and he brought them supplies in a hurry, but it was obvious that it was a bigger thing than we could cope with. It was still the early days when we were still, I think, in Feldafing. Mm-hmm. So we got UNRWA to assign somebody quickly to that place, and a new UNRWA camp was established there.
Don't you remember that camp?
It was small, and a very good guy, if I'm not mistaken, a fellow named Atkins, Sam Atkins, a Jewish UNRWA guy.
Do you know where he would be?
Was assigned there. No, I'd have no idea. But UNRWA was set up a camp, an UNRWA camp in that area. Now, a subject of some controversy might be Fehrenwald or Wolfritzhausen, mm-hmm. The camp, Fehrenwald, F-O-E-R-E, or something, R-E-N-W-A-L-D, or Wolfritzhausen. I think a number of people have claimed credit for creating that as sort of for the first time, a decent kind of DP camp. It was a series of cottages clustered together, which I think the German army had used for German officers. And after the war, a number of DPs had moved into those units. And they were small houses, small cottages, and it made for a much better kind of living situation than these terribly overcrowded conditions we had in Feldafing and Wolfertshausen and Landsberg, where it was just outrageous. There were about 6,000 Jews in Feldafing, and the maximum the place could have held was 2,000. And this was at a time when they were in such great need, medically and every other way, emotionally. And maybe Abe had showed me Fehrenwald, and maybe it was the one who even suggested this ought to be made into a Jewish DP camp. And in any event, I believe there was a Major Fischer with military government in Bavaria at that time. Abe knew him, and his job was the displaced persons, military government in the Third Army, Patton's Army headquarters. I think his name was Fischer. And I had, one of the things I could do as JDC person, I could be an official kind of liaison with the Army, and I could come in and ask and request and make demands and whatnot. And I did go to, I had the UNRWA credentials, I did go to this Army officer on a number of occasions and said, look at these terribly overcrowded conditions we have in Feldafing. Give us that camp, and let's move some of the people there. And you can't have a mixed Jewish-Christian DP camp, and besides, those Christian DPs just haven't suffered in any way at all compared to my people. And I got a stall from this guy, and he just, delayed it. And the day the decision was made, I know I was there, was the day that General Patton and General Eisenhower visited Feldafing. And they made a tour of Feldafing. This was the result of the outcry in the States. This must have been, August 45. It was a result, the reports had been filtering back to the States about how terrible the lot of the DPs was, this Sharit HaPleita. And this Feldafing kind of place, the living conditions were just horrible. And the Germans were walking around comfortable and all that. And, enough people had gone back and forth, visiting dignitaries and whatnot. So a tremendous hullabaloo was being raised in the States, and the JDC helped activate that because it had its reports from us. And Eisenhower finally was told, in effect, to go and look at that camp. And since it was Patton's territory, Patton escorted him. And I was part of the official group that walked around the camp with them. And, there were about 20 of us, UNRWA people and Army officers, including this Major Fischer, if that was his name. He was, the official liaison with the displaced. He was in charge of displaced person program for the Third Army, Patton's Army. We were walking around, and I was standing. It was really one of the good experiences. Patton and Eisenhower were going through the barracks, these terribly crowded barracks. And I remember Eisenhower, several incidents had happened. Eisenhower came to a place where he saw some sewing machine heads without tables, just sewing machines, a large number of them, sitting in the warehouse. They couldn't be used. The people were idle. That was one of the big problems. They desperately needed clothing. So they had tailoring experience. They could make clothing for themselves, and there were these useless machines, sewing machines, sitting there. And Eisenhower stopped and he looked at it, and he asked somebody what they were doing there. Well, that somebody was a Lieutenant Irving Smith, who was the military government person in charge. He was Jewish, incidentally. Right. And Irv Smith had done in Feldafing, he had his shortcomings too. He had his Gentile girlfriend, if I'm not mistaken, but he had also been, he was still a Jew, and he'd begun to identify with the people. And he had done quite a lot to try to do things. I don't remember his relationship with Abe. I suspect there might have been some clashes because they were both guys with pretty good egos. And but Eisenhower turned to Smith, a lieutenant, that he was in charge of the camp, and he says, "Lieutenant, what are those things doing there?" And Smith said, "Well, General, we can't use them without tables to put them on." And General said, "Well, why don't you get some tables for it?" And Lieutenant Smith said, "Well, General," he said, I've tried to requisition some, but I just haven't been able to get them." And Eisenhower said, "Well, if I want to trace this down, where did you submit the requisition, all that, G2 or G4 or something in 3rd Army headquarters. So if I wanted to trace down why we don't have those tables, I would have to look to the officer who was in charge of G2 or G4, whatever it was, in 3rd Army headquarters." And Lieutenant Smith, who knew that that general was standing right there in that same party, sort of gulped and said, "Yes, General." And Eisenhower then turned to Patton. He says, "George," he said, "now if we had some artillery pieces over here, and we needed a carriage for them over here, the artillery pieces wouldn't be any good without the carriages, would they?" Patton said, "That's right." And Eisenhower said, "Well, George, what we'd do then, would we try to get those two things together, wouldn't we, George?" And Patton said, "You're right, General." He says, these things just weren't here when I was here last week," or something like that. And he was a goddamn liar. I knew for a fact that Patton had been there a week earlier, and everything was exactly the same as it had been when Eisenhower was there. And then Eisenhower walked through some of the barracks, and he saw the crowded conditions. And I remember his saying to Patton, "George, if Harry could see this, he would sure blow his top." Harry Truman. And this sort of thing happened. We got to the end of the tour, and they were standing around talking, and Eisenhower, he'd gotten plenty of pressure from the States, and he just didn't like what he saw. And he was a decent man. And I think there was some conversation about these overcrowded conditions. And at that point, Major Fisher, whom I'd been working with closely, said, and it was the first time I heard it, to Eisenhower, General, he says, "Well, we've already made plans to create another Jewish DP camp over at Farnwald, and we're going to move half of these people over there and relieve these crowded conditions." That was the moment that Farnwald was made a Jewish DP camp. And I don't think Abe was in that party. I don't think he could have quite been part of that official party. And sure enough,
that's how it.
That's how it happened. And like the next day, things started, and and within a week, I got a call from one of the top generals to Patton, who called me. Well, first of all, there was a lean Texan general named Polk, who was in charge of the army in that part of Bavaria, the 20th Corps or something of that sort, and Feldafing was in his area. And, he was a fighting general, a West Pointer tank commander. Mm-hmm. And he called me a day or two later and asked me to come over. I was under his jurisdiction, authority. And he said to me, "Look," he said, "I am a West Pointer, the Army's my career, and somebody's been criticizing me, and probably it's been people like you. And he said, I don't want to jeopardize my career over this thing, and I want you to tell me what I can do to improve the situation in that camp."
Do you remember when this was?
Yeah, within a week after that visit by Eisenhower. And as a matter of fact, within a week, a lot of things began to flow into Feldafing through his efforts, General Polk, who later, if I'm not mistaken, became chief of staff and top general in Germany for the Army. I couldn't help but feel sorry for the guy. He had, up to then, had never known a Jew in his life. He had no interest in these DP camps. He was a fighting general. He had fought valiantly. He had lost lots of troops in helping to liberate these DP camps, and within a week or two after that visit, I got a call from Patton's second in command, his chief of staff, or I think his title was, I've forgotten his name, to 3rd Army Headquarters. Again, you know, I was an official channel, I was a civilian, and I represented this big American Jewish political constituency to these sort of naive guys that was creating such trouble for them. And he called me over, and this was already, now things, within that 2-week period, supplies had been sent in, more food was sent in, you know, the Army, as a result of that visit, was suddenly galvanized. They were worried. And this guy, this chief of staff, called me over and he said, I want you to make a public statement as to what we have been doing in the last 2 weeks to improve the situation in the DP camps. Now, at that point, Patton's tenure was already in jeopardy. These men around him literally worshipped him. His immediate, well, there was a religious reverence for this man, and they saw him threatened. And he wanted me to make a public statement that the Army had done a good job, particularly recently, to straighten this problem out, hoping, I think, to help save his head that way. Well, how could I do this, you know, and let this get back to the American Jewish community? An official JDC representative, in effect, whitewashing Patton. Well, I said, you know, I'll have to check on this, and I never did make such a statement, but before he could call me back, this general, I've forgotten his name, so say, okay now, let's have that statement. I was saved by the fact that in those sort of next 2 days, Patton was fired by Eisenhower. That was the famous showdown they had, I think, in Frankfurt, where, you know, it was a number of incidents. It was not just the DP program. It was slapping soldiers in the face and just being totally incompetent for this kind of an administrative job that an occupation army had at this point. And that's where Eisenhower fired him. But that's how Fahrenwald or Wolfertshausen became a DP camp. Now, it may be Abe who had the first idea of using that as a camp. But, all right, let's get back to Abe. I really shouldn't be defending the JDC this way, and I don't mean to. It's old history, and the JDC has adequately acquitted itself since then. In terms of Abe's role, it is so long ago. I can just say that I remember the.
All right,
if I'm sure I have a lot more I could say about Klausner, but I would need to have my recollection refreshed. It was a 6-month period that I saw him. As I say, I was the only JDC person at that point in Bavaria with any sustained experience there who could have seen what he did. Much of it would have to be refreshed, but my overall recollection was that it was a tour de force.
Did you write letters home in that period of time to your wife? Or you weren't married then?
I wasn't married then. I wrote very few letters. There was just no time. As I say, I wrote one JDC report. I might have said something about Klausner in that report, but probably the report. They were interested in what the JDC had done, and I may have mentioned Klausner in passing, but I don't think there was much. If I saw Abe's report or tape sometimes, this might give me some recollections.
Well then maybe what I'll do is try to send you a copy to take a look at.
Yeah, and then I could perhaps send you something in writing.
Were you involved in any way with the package program that Rabbi Klausner started? He had told me, for instance.
Yeah, he got people to mail packages.
That's right. At a certain point, it was turned over to the JDC. Do you remember that? How that happened? Once he had gotten it going.
I'm sure he started it. I'm sure we did not.
Yeah, there's no question that.
Now he may have turned it over to us in the camps. You mean for distribution?
Well, Eventually, I think you took the warehouse, or wherever it was.
We had a large warehouse in Landsberg. That was, I think, maybe it was the owner warehouse, maybe it was ours, or maybe some part of it was ours. The reason I remember that is because one of the few satisfying experiences I had in those early days, and this may have been after we had moved to 3 Siebertstrasse, the JDC did have, I had written to the JDC, don't you have